Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something really fascinating and I think pretty crucial actually. It's a deep dive into these 17th century techniques, these technologies that kind of secretly engineered what we think of as modern individuality. We're not really talking kings or, big flashy battles. We're focused much more on the quiet, often missed mechanics of power. We're pulling this mostly from sources talking about something called the means of correct training.
That's absolutely right. And, the sources really highlight the central paradox. The biggest force shaping how we see ourselves today, it wasn't that spectacular, visible power of the king, the big public parades, the ceremonies. It was something much quieter, almost like bureaucratic background noise. The sources actually call it a modest minor procedure, even a scarcely secret invasion. And this subtle, really methodical power, it just gradually worked its way into and really changed the whole structure of the modern state.
Yeah, I find that idea just so gripping because we're sort of trained culturally, aren't we, to
Right.
look for power where it's shouting loudest, where you can really see it, the big expensive rituals. But what we're getting into today is, well, the total opposite. Humble methods, tiny procedures, but they created this permanent, really highly calculated system and economy of power.
And what does that really mean in
Hmm.
practical terms? It means power stopped being so expensive. You don't need massive old crowns anymore or huge costly armies just to manage people effectively. Suddenly it's cheap, it's detailed, and it basically runs like 247 on observation and, well, paperwork.
And that efficiency, that's really the hook for today's deep dive, isn't it? So our goal for you listening in is to really see how these three pretty simple tools came together: hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and the examination. And how together they basically invented a system that turned people into, well, both manageable subjects and into analyzable objects of knowledge. This mix, this is how the modern individual, the one who's documented, measured, known, essentially came to be.
Okay, yeah. Let's really unpack that shift. It's quite something. So, when we look at discipline in its historical context, especially, like you said, through those 17th century military manuals, Wallhausen is a key one. Its function is just starkly different from older ways of control. Older military setups, they were mostly designed to link forces together, right? To make one big unified block that moves together, fights together. The goal was really solidarity, brute force, often built on these big, showy displays of loyalty.
Right, like a single mass.
Yeah.
But the strict discipline that Wallhausen talks about, it's after something much, much finer grained. It's not about linking anymore. It's about training and selection. It's almost like an act of decomposition, breaking things down. The sources really stress that discipline isn't just trying to subdue a crowd. It wants to multiply and then use the individual bits it separates out.
Precisely. Yeah, decomposition's a good word. It carries out this really meticulous analysis. It breaks down bodies, forces, into what the texts call small, separate cells or organic autonomies, even sufficient single units. Uh, Think of it like taking a big chunk of marble, maybe, and instead of one big statue, you carve out, say, 1,000 identical, perfectly working little gears. Each gear is separate, yeah? But its function, its usefulness is maximized because it's been individually shaped and trained.
And that's where this power feels so modest, which I guess is why it was maybe underestimated, but also so effective. It's not working at the level of, the King's Majesty, the big pronouncements. It's working through these tiny procedures, these humble methods. But hang on, didn't the state still need the big visible stuff, the courts, the royal parades?
Yeah.
Is this quiet discipline really replacing that older power or just sort of adding to it?
That's a great question. It's not really a replacement. It's more like an invasion, a
Yeah.
subtle one. While all those traditional parts of the state, the courts, the big ministries, were doing their usual spectacular thing out in the open, this calculated permanent economy of power was kind of secretly altering how they worked from the inside. It was imposing these small, efficient, almost invisible procedures onto the major forms of power, making them operate differently, more efficiently perhaps. Discipline gives this alternative way to manage things that's just more detailed and frankly more effective at getting the most out of people.
So the goal becomes purely utilitarian then. It's not about getting loyalty or faith like the old kings wanted. It's about extracting capability, performance, getting stuff done.
Exactly. The ultimate aim is management and utility. That's the bottom line. By separating people out, analyzing them, discipline creates these trained, manageable, and crucially highly functional bodies, individuals. And it works so well because it gets maximum effect from using really simple, repeatable tools. Tools that you can then scale up and use everywhere: army, school, hospital, factory.
Okay, so the first of these simple but really powerful instruments, hierarchical observation. This is where just looking, just watching, shifts from being, a casual thing people do into a proper political and scientific tool and apparatus. We often think of that classical age, the 17th, 18th centuries, as the time of huge breakthroughs in seeing, right? The telescope looking out, the microscope looking in.
Right. And at the very same time, this other, much less famous, obscure art was being perfected, a sort of minor technique of observation, but one that was carefully structured to make coercion visible just by arranging space. And it worked automatically, inducing effects in the people being watched, often without any direct physical force needed, just the setup itself.
The sources talk about building observatories of human multiplicity, which is a striking phrase. And the prime example, the sort of ideal model for this whole system was the military camp, which wasn't just a place for soldiers to crash, right? It was like a temporary artificial city designed from scratch to be way more active, more alert, and, well, way more controllable than any normal town.
Exactly. And this is where the sheer precision becomes so important. The architecture of the camp itself was the diagram of power. It wasn't accidental. They took the old kind of rough square layout and refined it, turned it into this precise geometry, all designed to maximize surveillance and cut out any wasted space, any hidden corners where someone could be unobserved.
Let's zoom in on those details because they really show the intent, don't they? The pure control aspect. The layout wasn't just random. The whole network of gazes of who can see what was literally built into how they position the tents and the streets. Like the arms depots and the junior officers' tents, they had to be exactly 10 feet apart, no more, no less. Company streets, precisely 51 feet wide. Tents, 2 feet apart. And the officers' tents were set back exactly 8 feet from the last soldier's tent in the row.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Measuring down to the foot. Why 51 feet for a street? Because that specific meticulous geometry made sure that every single movement could be seen by the officer standing at the end of the line. Every individual, every rank was precisely located, delimited. It just eliminated blind spots. It effectively reduces the soldier from being a person to just being a coordinate on a grid, a readable point, which maximizes how far the officer's gaze can reach, and that minimizes the need for actual physical force, or even needing lots of guards. Power gets exercised just through careful, exact observation.
It turns the whole structure into a machine for governing people. The sources actually say the camp was the spatial nesting of a hierarchical surveillance system, an architecture built specifically to act on the people inside it, to grip their conduct, to carry the effects of power right to them, making it possible not just to control them, but to know them, and maybe even change how they behave based on that knowledge.
Yeah. And this model, once they'd kind of perfected it in that temporary, hyper-controlled space of the camp, it just spread everywhere. Like wildfire, you see the exact same principles, the same geometric thinking turning up in other key places. Hospitals, schools, even things like early working-class housing projects, and of course prisons.
Okay, take the hospital example. It used to be just thick walls, heavy gates, right? Just keep the sick people contained.
Yeah.
How did they make a stone building docile and knowable, as the source puts it?
Well, the old design, the containment model, it gave way to an architecture defined by carefully calculated openings, transparencies. The building itself was designed to be an instrument for medical action. The architecture allowed for two really critical things. First, much better observation of the patients, which meant, better adjustment of treatments, better data collection, science, really. And second, better separation of patients, often using specific ways to circulate air, placement of windows, all explicitly designed to stop disease vapors from spreading. Contagion control. So surveillance, which fed medical knowledge, got baked right into the building's design.
Wow. So where you put a wall or a window, it suddenly becomes a medical decision, a political one, and a behavioral one, all rolled into one.
Exactly right. And another really powerful example is the École Militaire, the military school. The architect there, Perry Duvernay, he basically planned the whole building as a total teaching machine, a pedagogical mechanism. Students were kept in separate, tiny cells at night. Total individualization.
And the surveillance details there were just incredibly minute, weren't they? The source points out that Paris insisted the windows on the corridor side of each room, they had to be placed really low, just 1 or 2 feet off the floor. Why so low? That seems odd.
Yeah, it wasn't for the view. Or even for good light. It was purely about discipline. It was designed so the supervisor walking down the corridor could, with a quick glance, see the entire pupil. Or at least see their table, their workspace, everything they were doing. But maybe even more importantly, the student knowing that low window was there. They're constantly reminded that they could be watched at any moment, even if they can't see the observer. And that forces you to internalize the gaze, right? You start watching yourself.
Ah, Okay, that's the really crucial shift, isn't it? It moves from direct physical correction, like a rap on the knuckles,
Mm.
to getting the person to monitor themselves, internalize self-control. So the result of this constant watching, this continuous gaze, it isn't just about having one all-powerful warden figure. It's about creating this decentralized network, a functional surveillance system, like a perfect eye that nothing would escape, as the source says. The disciplinary power starts to operate like a machine, always alert, totally discrete, connecting bottom to top, and it spreads power throughout the whole system, deriving its effects from the entire field, not just from one person at the top.
And the ultimate result is that coercion becomes less, well, less physical in how it's done, fewer public whippings maybe,
Hmm?
but it becomes more subtle, more pervasive, more psychological, but still physical in its effects on posture, on habit. It ensures people comply mainly through the permanent threat of being seen, of being caught deviating.
Okay, so if hierarchical observation is the tool that sort of generates the raw data about what individuals are doing, then normalizing judgment, this next mechanism, is the tool that applies the measuring stick to that data. It shows exactly where each individual stands, how they deviate from, well, from the average, from the norm. And this is where we see justice itself get fundamentally redefined, right?
That's right. Disciplinary punishment is really unique because it's got almost nothing to do with the big laws of the state. It's not worried about treason or murder or grand theft. It relates entirely to specific offenses against the rules of the particular institution. The workshop rules, the school timetable, the military protocols.
So this creates a whole new kind of judicial area. The sources call it infrapenality, below the main law. And it deals with all the tiny details of human behavior that the big laws just didn't bother with. It's not about major crimes. It's about this huge list of minor infractions. Things like impoliteness, disobedience, having the wrong posture, incorrect attitudes, lack of zeal, being late, being careless. Even things like minor sexual behavior, impurity, indecency get caught in this very detailed code.
Yeah, and the level of bureaucratic energy poured into correcting these tiny things is just astounding. These seemingly small offenses were put through this incredibly meticulous system of comparison and correction. Take that example from the orphanage of the Chevalier Paulet. It's quite something. Every single morning, they held this elaborate session that basically mimicked a grand court trial.
Right, a council of 24 officers plus a major would assemble, and the pupils, the kids, were lined up as if for battle, totally silent, aligned. They'd hear the accused kid, hear witnesses, they'd deliberate, and then solemnly announce the punishments.
Just think about that for a second. 24 officers debating whether a 12-year-old was too slow putting out a lamp, or if they said something mean about a friend. The sheer scale of the judicial ritual around these tiny infractions, it was enormous. And it was enormous precisely because the goal wasn't really about retribution, getting even. It was about total behavioral correction, shaping the person.
And the punishments themselves reflected that goal too.
Yeah.
They were usually small things, weren't they? Small deprivations or calculated little humiliations, designed to kind of hit your internal sense of pride, your social standing, rather than inflict serious physical pain.
Exactly. There were these subtle procedures aiming for psychological and social pressure. Things like being marked down for a half day, whatever that entailed, or forbidding your friends to greet you for a while, social isolation. Or, in the army, forcing a soldier who messed up handling his rifle. He had to repeat the whole lesson the next day perfectly, and he'd be treated with the greatest severity, which often just meant relentless repetition until he got it absolutely right. These were all designed to instill this deep, internalized sense of shame and the need to correct yourself, to fit
So
in.
it stops being about whether you broke the king's big law and becomes about whether you failed to meet some predetermined standard, a skill level, a behavioral expectation. And that brings us right to the core function of this whole judgment system: normalization.
Yes. Normalization introduces this value-giving measure that just wasn't really there before, not in the same way. It starts to replace the old simple binary of, allowed versus forbidden. Instead, you get a spectrum, a range. And it compares individuals not against the law, but against an average or an optimum standard, or maybe a minimum threshold you have to meet, a threshold for competence, ability, even your basic personal nature.
Ah, I see the connection now. Observation gives you the raw data on behavior, and normalizing judgment processes that data through this kind of statistical lens. It differentiates people, it ranks them, it homogenizes them towards the average, and then, crucially, it excludes anyone who falls too far outside that measured range. Creating these categories like the shameful class they had at the École Militaire, a formal group defined purely by their measurable failure to conform to the norm.
Right, and the power of the norm starts to kind of edge out, or at least fundamentally change, the traditional power of the sovereign, the power of the law. The whole goal shifts towards imposing this predictable homogeneity, sameness, but within a formal system that, on the surface, insists on equality. Everyone's subject to the same rules, the same measurements. And this system uses constant surveillance and ranking as its main tools, replacing older ways of identifying people, like your aristocratic title or your family background, with this new measurable degree of normality, competence, and usefulness.
And this shift focusing on the norm, not just the law, is what the sources are calling the penalty of the norm. This idea seems to be the sort of unacknowledged root of what they call the judicio-anthropological functioning that just runs through almost all our modern institutions. Standardized tests in schools, clinical psychology, how our criminal justice system uses psychological evaluations. It's all about measuring deviation, isn't it? And having the power to correct it. Okay, this brings us to the final mechanism, the third leg of the stool, the examination. And this really acts as the ultimate synthesis, doesn't it? It pulls the other two together. It's this grand, yet incredibly detailed ceremony where hierarchical observation making you visible and normalizing judgment making you measurable get fused. It's highly ritualized, apparently, and it does two things at once. It demonstrates the subjection of the person being observed, and really critically, it achieves their objectification, turns them into an object of study.
This is probably the single most crucial innovation we're talking about today, because the examination creates this nexus point where power relations, who's in charge, who's being controlled, and knowledge relations, what we know, how we knew it, are laid right on top of each other. They become inseparable. It is the core technique for turning that political need to control and train people into actual usable knowledge about those individuals. It's a technology, really, not just an idea or an ideology.
And the sources show just how incredibly pervasive this became, especially in education. It wasn't just, one big final exam at the end. For the Brothers of the Christian Schools, for instance, pupils were facing daily exams, daily, in catechism and arithmetic. And then on top of that, a monthly exam by the inspector. This sheer amount of testing is just staggering.
Yeah, the testing schedule was relentless, but it had to be because it served that disciplinary function. It wasn't just about checking learning. Look at the École des Ponts et Chaussées, the engineering school, back in 1775. 16 exams a year, 3 in maths, 3 in architecture, 2 in drawing, 1 in writing, and so on. The exam wasn't just about proving you were competent. It was this permanent, repeated ritual. It validated the whole power structure. It ensured the constant flow of knowledge from the teacher, establishing their authority. And it precisely defined the pupil's individual level of competence and, just as importantly, pinpointed their deficiencies, where they fell short of the norm.
And that level of intense, constant testing naturally requires a whole infrastructure to support it, right? Which brings us to the documentary techniques, what the source calls the power of writing. All the registers, the records, the constant documentation, these were absolutely vital for discipline to work across large numbers of people, across big institutions.
Totally. Without the paperwork, the whole system just grinds to a halt. It couldn't scale. They tracked army deserters with detailed descriptions. They mapped how diseases spread in hospitals using individual patient records. They registered everything about children in schools, their piety, their aptitude, their family background. The act of writing it down turns the individual's fleeting performance or their condition at one moment into permanent, manageable data, something you can store, compare, analyze later.
And this mountain of writing, it opened up two really critical possibilities. First, it sort of constituted the individual as this unique, describable, analyzable object, reducing them, in a way, to their specific features, their personal progress, their skills, their abilities, all captured under the constant, nonstop gaze of this apparatus that was dedicated to generating knowledge about them.
And second, and this is where you really see the calculated economy aspect kick in, it made it possible to measure things across the whole group, overall phenomena. By recording every single person's score or their deviation from the norm, they could start calculating averages. They could understand the statistical distribution of skills or behaviors within a population, and they could spot where the gaps were, identify where they needed to create specialists or target specific training or interventions. This is basically the foundation of modern population management. Statistics applied to people.
So the ultimate outcome of this whole rigorous written procedure is that the examination makes the individual into a case. It establishes them as an object of knowledge, something to be described, judged, measured, compared with others, and perpetually classified, filed away.
And this specific detail, this focus on the case, represents a really profound historical reversal. It's a huge shift. Before, say, the 18th century, the privilege of having your life written down, your body described in detail, your history recorded, your biography composed that was strictly reserved for the elite, the king, the conquering hero, the powerful aristocrat, historiography, writing history, belonged to the great men.
But these disciplinary methods, they completely flip that hierarchy upside down.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the case, the ordinary individual's life, their documented behavior, their health records, their failures, their background, their deviations from the norm, this became the permanent archive for everybody else. The person deemed mad, the patient in the hospital, the prisoner, the school child, all of a sudden the history of the average person was being meticulously documented, day by day, test by test, observation by observation.
And the sources are really clear on this. This explosion of writing functions as a procedure of objectification, not heroization. You're not being documented because you're a hero, or important in the old sense. You're being documented because you are a subject under constant technical management, an object to be known and administered.
So the final implication here is just massive, isn't it? The individual that we recognize today, the one defined by their specific psychological profile, their documented history, their measurable skills, their quantifiable status, this isn't some kind of inherent, natural, or even just ideological ideal of what a human is. The individual, in this sense, is a reality that was actively fabricated, built by this specific technologies of power they call discipline.
Exactly. Discipline took all those individual differences, status, background, privilege, and it fixed them, pinned them down, linked them irrevocably to measurable characteristics, things you could test for, observe, record. And it made the gaps between individuals, their deviations from the norm, the very marks that defined them, that created their permanent managed case. Power works best when it's invisible, yeah. But it absolutely demands the compulsory round-the-clock visibility of its subjects. Hashtag, outro. So we just step back and summarize this huge historical shift we've been tracing. Power basically moved, didn't it? It moved from being this spectacular, really expensive, and often quite intermittent display, something shown on the king's body in these grand public rituals, to becoming this quiet, incredibly efficient, and absolutely permanent technology. A technology that gets inscribed directly onto the behavior, the habits, even the physical bodies of the subjects, and it's constantly maintained by the compulsory visibility that they're forced into, always potentially under observation.
Yeah, that shift is subtle in how it happened, maybe, but the result is just total, absolute. We went from a society defined by the spectacle of the sovereign to a society defined by this invisible, omnipresent network of permanent surveillance and measurement.
So thinking about this, what does it all mean for you listening now? Just consider for a moment how incredibly common, how ubiquitous these three mechanisms still are in your own life today. Continuous testing, constant evaluation from the moment you start school right through your professional life. It's fundamental, isn't it? Think about performance reviews at work, credit scores, health tracking apps, insurance risk assessments, the algorithms that decide what news you see or what products you're offered. These are all direct descendants of that system. Hierarchical observation, feeding data into normalizing judgment, creating your documented, often digitized case. Where does this constant evaluation still shape your modern identity, your sense of worth?
The sources we've looked at show us that these disciplines, by creating the individual as this measurable case, they also created the very foundation for modern human sciences, psychology, sociology, criminology, that whole judicio-anthropological functioning. But if these disciplines were first developed with a pretty straightforward utilitarian goal, just imposing rationality, management, control onto behavior, simply subduing people and making them useful, then we have to ask this final, maybe provocative question. What happens now when the knowledge that's extracted using these disciplinary techniques, all that data that defines our individuality, our status, our supposed worth, when that knowledge is no longer just a tool of power, but it becomes the actual product being sought, the commodity being harvested by the most powerful algorithms and systems we have today? What new kinds of control start to emerge when the main goal isn't just to subdue the self anymore, but to actively constitute the self, to perpetually optimize it, based on analyzing that permanent stream of data, making your very individuality the ultimate thing to be managed and perhaps profited from. Something definitely ponder deeply. Until our next dive.